Um, I would also love to hear what your key takeaways from the morning were, from the first keynote and the first panel. You can throw that in the chat, but let's get started by introducing our panelists. And let's start with Alicia Shaw. Can you tell us how you came to the fight, and what you guys are doing in New Mexico?
Thank you so much. It's really exciting to be a part of this. So, I'm Alicia. I am the campaign director for Public Power New Mexico, and we're a grassroots statewide coalition that's working to advance community owned renewable power that invests in our communities and their sustainability. And so we are basically dedicated to pursuing every strategy and project we can to that end. Most recently, we ran some legislation in the last legislative session here in New Mexico to enable our communities to pursue what is commonly known as community choice aggregation, but what we call local choice energy. We've also worked in support of community solar, which there is a pilot community solar law in New Mexico that's just getting off the ground now. And we've worked towards statewide public power as well. We're currently working on a bill that would create a fund at the state level to grant to local governments, municipalities, counties, and tribes to solarize public buildings and infrastructure. And we've also explored municipalization, but we haven't gotten that on the ground as much yet. So that's kind of an overview of what we're working on.
Awesome. Sean, could you introduce yourself and what DSA is doing in Chicago, or has done in Chicago?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks so much, Eric, and everybody that's been attending. It's been really exciting conversations that have been happening. So my name is Sean Estelle. I use they, them pronouns. I've been living in Chicago for about 9 years. And yeah, I'm a volunteer organizer with Chicago Democratic Socialists of America and DSA more broadly. I've been doing climate organizing since about 2012. Met Jackson through some student and youth climate organizing work, and first got introduced to concepts of public power, municipalization campaigns, and energy democracy and the movement for energy democracy more broadly. And in Chicago, we were starting to build up our mass volunteer dues-funded membership organization and looking for campaigns. And we had a elected official, Alderman Carlos Ramirez Rosa, who knew that I was starting to look into and do research on public power and utility justice. And he told me about a meeting that was happening in City Council where ComEd was starting to talk about the renegotiation of the franchise agreement for the first time since the late 80s. And so that was sort of an immediate trigger point for us to research, put together a campaign to call for municipalization, and then also a host of other demands too. So I'll get more into the details of the campaign, but we've been in motion since 2019, working to municipalize our local electric utility, and then also building up a lot of the infrastructure for an eco-socialist Green New Deal across the country as well, and having public power be one of the key scaffolds in that. So yeah, we were able to kill a proposed franchise agreement from the old mayor just this last February, and we're now in a really interesting moment with a labor organizer as the mayor of Chicago. So it's exciting and the work continues.
Awesome. Thank you, Sean. And Greg, would you introduce yourself in Ann Arbor for Public Power?
Absolutely. Thank you, Eric. My name is Greg Woodring, he, him pronouns. I'm the president and co-founder of Ann Arbor for Public Power. A2P2 started about a little over 3 years ago now with a group of us actually in the Huron Valley Democratic Socialists looking at what is it that we could do to try to help the city reach its climate goals, right? The city had just adopted a very aggressive 2030 carbon neutrality date. but unfortunately, there wasn't a realistic pathway to really reach that, right? Community choice aggregation was suggested, but as was discussed in yesterday's panel, it's currently illegal in the state of Michigan. When we met with our state senator, our state representative, Jeff Irwin and Yusuf Rabi, they both did not believe that it was very likely that that would change due to the amount of influence that our investor-owned utility DTE has in our legislature. So we started to explore this idea of municipalization. And as we dug into it more and more, we realized that not only is it a fantastic way for us to reach our climate goals, but it also is a great way for us to address the reliability and cost issues that we're seeing in our community. So far in our campaign, I'm really proud to say that we've really done a good job of it establishing the legal viability of the project. There was a lot of ambiguity about that early into it. There hasn't been a successful municipalization campaign in 100 years, as Brandy alluded to earlier in the keynote. And so that was a really big win for us. And then furthermore, we've got the city to fund a feasibility study, which should hopefully be released somewhere near the end of the month. So the campaign is moving along very strongly. We continue to pick up membership and interest, and we're going full speed ahead towards full municipalization here in Ann Arbor.
Awesome. Thank you guys for introducing yourself. Let's dig a little bit deeper and get into like what are the specifics in your community around like distributing power, and what makes your community like what makes your community's service needs unique? Alicia, would you mind starting us off?
Sure. So, we're statewide, so I'll just talk about New Mexico as a broad state. But in Santa Fe, where I live, we're subject to the state's largest regulated monopoly utility. As a whole, we have 7 municipal utilities, 3 investor-owned utilities, 16 rural electric cooperatives, and 3 tribal utilities, as well as the community solar law that is just beginning to get off the ground with limited number of community solar projects. So we do kind of have a diverse landscape, although most people in the state are served by the investor-owned utilities. I mean, what makes us unique is that in New Mexico, we have 300 days of sunshine. But despite that, only 6.5% of our entire electricity mix is solar, which I think points to the problem in terms of the differences between what our communities want and what the investor-owned utilities want. They want to make money, they want profits, and the things that, incentivize, the things that create profits for them are the dirtiest, most resource intensive, most expensive fuel sources. So, we have this huge potential in New Mexico. We could power the whole state. We could probably power the whole region with the renewable resources we have. And so people really are interested in taking control and having community-owned renewable power to really lead our renewable energy future. The problem is that the extractive industries have a huge outsized political influence here. So, we're kind of looking at ways to work with that system, but also work around it to catalyze the renewable energy future we want, driven by our communities.
Awesome. Sean? Yeah.
Cool. Yeah. So, I'll just talk briefly. Most of what I want to talk about during this is about like the politics of the campaigning, because that's sort of my expertise. But one of the things that I think is worth touching on specifically for Chicago and Illinois more broadly is that it's sort of the home of this, or where it was invented, with this layering of state-regulated, private, investor-owned monopolies. And so ComEd is referred to as a public utility, but that was a term that was invented by actually ComEd and Exelon's founder to eliminate competition from municipal utilities. And so you have all of these different regulatory bodies, and then ComEd being a distribution utility that owns the poles and wires, but is a subsidiary of Exelon, which owns most of the nuclear generation in Illinois. So there's all of this interweaving of the power players. And you see energy policy being one of the main drivers in terms of politics in Illinois, too, where under a Republican governor, Bruce Rauner, energy policy, the Future Energy Jobs Act, was one of the only bipartisan bills that passed. And then under J.B. Pritzker, more recently, the Clean Energy Jobs Act, which is one of the most aggressive statewide policies for decarbonization, was able to pass in the last couple of years. So it's a really interesting time, but we also see a lot of disparities in terms of energy burden. People in Chicago talk about how there's one map when you look at racial segregation, when you look at housing, when you look at energy burden, all of these sorts of things. That stratification and that inequality plays out in the energy mix too. And ComEd is deeply embroiled in all of that and in using their political power in order to get more profits for their shareholders, being a private utility. So that was sort of the impetus for us to really look at establishing a horizon for publicly owned energy.
I suppose I'll go next. Yeah, so in Michigan broadly, we are in a difficult position with our power system, right? Our utilities, particularly with DTE, though consumers is also not very great on this, are incredibly unreliable. There's been studies that have shown that in terms of minutes of downtime, we're the second worst in the nation, right? Additionally, it's extremely expensive. Under DTE, we're 12% above the national average. And yet, and additionally, our legislature is very captured by the lobbying interest of our monopoly utilities, right? There's only about 10 legislatures in both the House and the Senate that have refused money from the incumbent utilities, with our governor taking over $200,000, who directly appoints the Public Service Commission that's supposed to oversee them, right? So we've got a bit of a fox guarding the hen house situation where the entities that's supposed to be regulating these regulated utilities are actually the regulators. Additionally, we have some very restrictive franchise laws. Dr. Stultz actually alluded to this yesterday, but we have something called the Foot Act in Michigan. It was a 1905 law. And without going too deep into it, essentially what it did was, in an effort to standardize the contracts for energy franchise agreements, it actually eliminated the expiration dates on all franchise agreements. And despite lots of advocacy over the 100 and nearly 30 years since that law was passed, including a constitutional amendment, the courts have upheld it time and time again due to private property rights. And so we're in this really weird situation where, despite the fact that we have this very poorly performing utility and we have a comparatively better utility right next to us in Ann Arbor, we're not allowed to switch. We can't renegotiate the franchise agreement, and there's not a whole lot we can do to really hold our utilities accountable, especially because of how much power they have at the state level. And so when we dig into this in Ann Arbor context, there really is not another good way to start to address the reliability issues, which have gotten outrageous in the last few years, along with the climate concerns, without a municipalization drive. Why Ann Arbor specifically? Ann Arbor is probably of the communities that don't already have public power utilities, they probably are the most firmly in the Venn diagram of wealthy enough to complete such a task and progressive enough to want to, right? I personally live in Ypsilanti, which is just outside of Ann Arbor. And, there are many people across the state, including in Ypsilanti, that are looking towards Ann Arbor as kind of that vanguard for this movement. But, we're organizing in Ann Arbor here because we believe that it is the most well-positioned community to be able to take this fight on, as I said, in over 100 years. And it can kind of open that doorway for other communities to follow in its footsteps.
Absolutely. Thank you, Greg. And thank you to all of you. I do want to get into, you mentioned franchise agreements, Greg. In Decorah, Iowa, and Chicago, the expiration of franchise agreements played a pretty big role in launching the campaign. If Sean, you would open us up, and then Greg, you can tell us about the Foot Act. But what essentially, how did the campaigns impact franchise agreement negotiations? Like, how did that negotiation impact um, the outcomes going on in Chicago? We were hoping to have someone from Clayton County Energy Districts to talk to you guys about what was going on in Iowa. Um, but definitely tell us about how the franchise agreement has been a organizing turning point for you all and why it can't be in Michigan.
Yeah, so I'm gonna drop a few links in the chat and try and go fast here, because basically this is only the fourth or fifth time that the franchise agreement has been renegotiated with Chicago. There's some political education and history of the different agreements that have happened. But basically, we wanted to look at this franchise agreement as a moment when there would be news, there would be media, there would be city council discussions happening. So it was an opportunity to educate the broader public about what was going on, and then also to fashion a set of political demands to demand something different and essentially set a different horizon. And so what we did was we were in the process of endorsing a set of candidates for city council, integrating those demands for a municipal utility and a new franchise agreement. Basically, we set a horizon, as I said, of wanting a municipally owned utility, but then also developing a set of demands for the franchise agreement itself. So a shorter franchise agreement, something that was in the order of 5 to 10 years, having a community advisory board, moving towards actual democratic control, thinking about what it would mean to have a progressive rate structure, and then also basic decarbonization goals too. And so once we got our folks elected, they were able to then use their bully pulpit in city council to start a debate around what it should look like. And they put forward a resolution in city council saying that there should be a feasibility study. We should look at what it would cost for municipalization rather than just going about business as usual. Simultaneously, ComEd was starting to come under scrutiny and then under fire for bribery in the Illinois legislature. And so that ended up bringing down one of the most powerful Democrats in the country, and definitely the most powerful Democrat in Illinois, Mike Madigan. And so you have this sort of perfect storm of the franchise agreement negotiations happening, Lori Lightfoot being a terrible politician and sort of taking all of her negotiating power with the private utility, saying we don't want public power, and instead seeing us and a small coalition of other groups fighting relentlessly and saying, like, this is what we want, going out, knocking doors, and then having our electeds do the same thing in the environmental committee and other things. And so, you know, we had the feasibility study come out, COVID kind of messed everything up, and it was clearly not a priority for the Lightfoot administration. And then in this last electoral cycle, it seemed like it was not going to be a priority for her. But then all of a sudden, like a month before the election, she came out with this draft franchise agreement that she had brokered behind closed doors with ComEd after the bribery scandal, after they had been everything that had happened. And so we were able to take our base and mobilize them, and then also our electeds, and say, no, this is not what we want to happen. And in fact, it became such like an issue that I gave a public comment in city council, and I ended up getting kicked out by the police because Lori Lightfoot took such offense to the way that myself and other people were politicizing the way that she was trying to essentially ram through a brokered agreement. So that's sort of the trajectory, a little bit of where we're at now. And then there's also a lot. One of the things too that I think is worth highlighting is how franchise agreement negotiations have been happening on a timeline of their own. And then there's also been this statewide energy policy that people have been fighting for, as well as environmental justice fights. And Jackson and others talked about how we see public power advocates starting to step up in other fights too. We see a broader coalition of climate justice organizers starting to gain more technical expertise in the utility realm, while also having, you know, frontline fights around infrastructure, stuff like that. And one of the biggest examples of that was a metal shredder down on the southeast side, General Iron, where it became a sort of flashpoint for environmental justice advocates in the city. And there was a strategic decision made by the ComEd campaign organizers to throw down super hard, mobilize for folks, even though we're like a majority white organization, a lot of membership on the north side. Folks decided to really throw down hard for this fight on the far southeast side of Chicago, so that we could build closer ties with environmental justice advocates and have a deeper connection and show what it would look like to pursue utility justice, pursue public power, pursue socialist demands for public ownership, while also throwing down for people that are having their material conditions affected by infrastructure that is really harmful as well. So yeah.
That's perfect. Thank you so much, Sean. Greg, I don't think we've defined what a franchise agreement is for folks. So if you could drop that out there for people before you get into the Foot Act stuff, I'd appreciate it.
Absolutely. So a franchise agreement, for anyone who doesn't know, is essentially a utility's right to use the public lands to put up their poles and wires and service electricity, right? You know, it's your ability to operate within a given locality. And in most communities, these are agreements that will expire after a set date, right? 5, 10, 20, 30 years is the traditional way to do it. And in Michigan, we, you know, started electrifying sometime around 1890-ish, right? You know, and by 1905, most communities, especially in the lower peninsula of Michigan that were particularly rural, had some form of electric franchise agreement, or they had some sort of public power of some sort, right? Or both. And there were many communities where there would be a public power utility, but there'd be supplemental electricity given by some other private power utility that would provide that power. That's actually the case in Ann Arbor. In 1896, Ann Arbor signed a electric franchise agreement with a company that is long gone to provide power to 26 electric light bulbs. There was already a public power utility. It operated a few dams as well as some other electrical generation. And that utility was sold off sometime in the early 20th century. However, that 1896 franchise agreement, when the Foot Act happened, got turned into a Foot Act franchise agreement, which means that it is now perpetual. And further court cases found that they were inheritable. So now this tiny little company that was providing power to 26 electric light bulbs got ate up by another company, got ate up by another company, ultimately got ate up by DTE, and DTE owns a perpetual franchise agreement in Ann Arbor. So we don't have exactly the same tool set that other communities and other states have to be able to fight this municipalization battle, but we are lucky in other ways. For one, there is a clause in the Michigan State Constitution that explicitly provides a pathway for the city to force the sale of all electrical infrastructure within its city boundaries. And furthermore, while another competitor utility could not step into the Ann Arbor area because of DTE's perpetual exclusive franchise, that does not apply to the city itself. The city maintains its franchise ability for its own municipal boundaries, which means that the city is able to compel the sale of electrical infrastructure and then operate its own utility within the city boundaries. Frustrating thing about this is that it does mean that we, at least as far as we're aware, and there are legal efforts undergone to see if this can be expanded, but as far as we're aware, it does mean that we're limited to the municipal boundaries of Ann Arbor, which, you know, if people are familiar with the Boulder case, maybe find some similarities with the issues that they had there with trying to expand beyond their municipal boundaries. But we do have a very clear pathway here. And, you know, that's very exciting, and also something that I think there's a lot of confusion about for, you know, the last several decades in Michigan, and the fact that we've kind of shown this pretty clearly, and we've gotten, you know, a lot of agreement among different legal minds in Michigan. It's pretty well accepted now that this is how the laws work on that. And so it's something we're proud of kind of laying out there.
Cool. Thank you so much. Alicia, I'd like to ask you a question. I'm not 100% sure how the franchise agreements work in New Mexico, but I'm more interested in, since Public Power New Mexico is focused on like the state level transfer of utilities. How what regulatory issues across the process are you running into? And have you dealt with in the past?
Yeah, well, I'd say the biggest one is that in New Mexico, our legislature, our governor, every state office, and our federal delegation, they're all elected Democrats. And so the legislature and the governor tend to be very good on social issues. But because we have one of the busiest oil fields in the world, in the southeastern part of our state, they are very much bought and paid for by the oil and gas industry and the utility industry. And it's very challenging to get any kind of climate related policy passed and anything that threatens the utilities. I mean, we did some calculations of the money just spent by the largest investor-owned utility in the state, PNM, that they contributed to the governor and legislators over the course of, I think we looked at about 3 years, and it was over $1 million. And we're a pretty small state, and that's big money here. We're a small, rural, poor state. That's big money. So that's the biggest issue, is they have an outsized influence. We haven't dealt with this exactly directly, but our Public Regulation Commission, which is the commission that regulates the investor-owned utilities, used to be a 5-member appointed body, and it's now a 5-member elected body. I misspoke. It is now a 3-member appointed body, because after they started to hold the utility accountable, they pushed through some legislation that put a constitutional amendment on the ballot that changed it from an elected to an appointed commission. And the ballot initiative was highly, it was misleading. It was misleading, and it was industry funded. A lot of the campaigning that happened, and a lot of it was dark money. So we don't even entirely know who all contributed, but we did know there were some disclosures that pointed to ExxonMobil being a contributor, for example. So now we have a very new 3-member appointed commission, and it remains to be seen how they're going to regulate these entities. There have been some pretty big red flags so far in terms of backdoor communications that are little questionable. So those are some regulatory issues. I'd say the other big issue we have with all of the kinds of community-owned policies, particularly around government owning power, is people have lost trust in the competence of our government. And so that's one of the things that kind of inspired one of the policies we're looking at now, to create a fund to solarize public buildings, because we believe that this will create not only more community-owned renewable power on the ground immediately, but also good examples to change the narrative. And we've been calling all the local governments, all the municipalities, all the tribal governments in the state, and we've been discovering some really amazing stories like one of the tribes in New Mexico is building and manufacturing its own solar panels and installing them, because PNM is completely unreliable for them, and they're trying to push forward through their own resiliency. One of the municipal utilities in the state, in a very conservative part of the state, is about to go 100% solar. There's another tribe that's 100% solar as well, and expanding their solar arrays. So there are these examples. And so I think highlighting those is one of the keys to shifting the narrative, and also finding ways to work outside of the broken political structures wherever we possibly can.
Absolutely. I agree. Like, one of the benefits of public ownership is that you have freedom to make your own decisions, and do things like go 100% solar. So I do want to open that question up to Sean and Greg as well. What other regulatory issues have you run into or overcome in the process? If there are any specifics at either the state, federal, or the local level. Cool. So I did think that the Foot Act and the franchise agreement would be the key to that. So this next question is for Greg. So in Ann Arbor, there are limits on enforcing that franchise agreement. What has your strategy been to fight this fight and push for public power despite having that Foot Act in your way as far as dissolving the franchise agreement?
Yeah, well, I would say that our first strategy was to be too stubborn to quit when we should have. We actually, we got started back in 2020, June of 2020. And we started organizing around this. There was a decent amount of pushback from the city, and it wasn't an idea that was out there really before we had started working on this. But we were determined. We had a supportive energy commissioner, which is a non-voting advisory board to the city. And through that, we managed to get some time to go ahead and present to the Energy Commission, and we started pushing on this there. At the same time, we were doing our homework and we were trying to figure out exactly what the legalities were, what this looks like. We were getting pushback from the city, from officials in the city telling us that it wasn't legal. And one of our members very generously donated to fund a legal study. And we had a very friendly law firm, Olsen Bisdock and Howard, up in Traverse City. Actually, some of the lawyers there are involved in the power board up in Traverse City, which is fantastic. And they did a really fantastic legal analysis that showed, yes, it is actually legal. And the city's energy attorney confirmed that this was correct. We passed it on to our attorney general, didn't comment on it, but didn't tell us that she thought it was incorrect either. And we've just been going about this on the basis of, this is going to be necessarily a mass movement, right? We need to be able to muster public support and public outcry to be able to push this forward, right? We are happy and excited to work with all of the elected officials we can. We've gotten some great endorsements from elected officials. Pretty much every state representative in our county is supportive of our efforts. We just actually got an endorsement from the County Democratic Party for our efforts. And slowly, I believe that we're starting to influence the city council on our efforts. We did manage to get them to fund a feasibility study, which took a lot of effort. We got 1,300 petition signatures pushing for that, which was not a small feat, especially for our capacity as an org back a few years ago. And we, as DTE has continued to crumble, it has been a lot of free advertising for us, right? I think that we are well positioned to take advantage of the tragedy that is the most recent effects climate change has had on our energy grid, right? Systematic underinvestment over at least the last 40 years in our energy grid has left it particularly susceptible to the climate-related problems that utilities like DTE have helped to create, right? And as we are seeing the logical end of such policies, I think it's really important that we're here to be able to articulate an alternative vision for how we can start to address these problems and build a more equitable system out of the ashes of the old. So that's what we're doing, and that's what we're fighting on.
Absolutely, and I've seen that firsthand over at A2P too. To that thought, Sean, you mentioned mobilizing with ComEd, Democratize ComEd, mobilizing in Chicago. Can you talk about what actions you all took and what resonated with your community on these issues to mobilize them?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's, I think, two tactics that come to mind immediately. One of which was when Bernie Sanders was running for president in 2020, and the Democratic Socialists of America broadly had endorsed Bernie and run an independent expenditure campaign where we were building our own field program. And we had a national Green New Deal campaign that wanted to sort of go all out and see this as an opportunity, Johanna talked a little bit yesterday about some of the Green New Deal stuff that Bernie had in his platform around establishing new regional power administrations. And so we were able to take the Democratized ComEd campaign and where we were at with the franchise agreements and build out lit that talked about the fight for public power locally and the connections to a federal electoral cycle and the need to go knock on doors and have conversations. And that was great. It was one of the peaks, I think, of us being able to take this somewhat wonky issue that oftentimes takes place in like meetings or like a meeting, meetings with aldermen or elected officials, or like, let's sit down and learn about what the electricity system is like and really turn it into, let's go have a conversation on the doors with other working class people about what it's going to look like. What does it mean to connect your electricity rates to climate change, to other issues that you see in your immediate material conditions. So we were able to do that. Obviously Bernie was not elected, unfortunately, but that's something that I think provided a really good opportunity for us to do some testing with what canvassing could look like. The other thing that comes to mind, more in the realm of direct action, during the pandemic, when the National Green New Deal campaign was building out days of action before Joe Biden got elected to fight for the broad swath of Green New Deal demands based on the principles that we had put together, which I'll drop in the chat here. We decided to mobilize to then Mayor Rahm Emanuel's house. Rahm Emanuel, this neoliberal who had carried out the legacy of trying to bust the Chicago Teachers Union, comes from like a financial trader background, just overall terrible person. And we decided to mobilize to his house and have a protest, which was really effective, I think, in being able to call out the history of what ComEd was doing in terms of its corruption, in terms of its long legacy of, business as usual, politics as usual, and how we needed a different horizon. So those are, I think, two tactical examples of how we were building our organization, talking with other broader working class folks. And then lastly, the last thing I'll say too is that we have a new mayor that got elected, Brandon Johnson, who comes from the left, comes from labor. And this link here is his transition team put together like a 90-page report on short, medium, and long-term demands. And in it, they call for a medium-term demand of a second phase municipalization study and really connecting it to utility justice, decreasing shutoffs, establishing like what environmental justice can look like across all of Chicago. So we see that convergence of environmental justice organizations that have been fighting infrastructure for a long time, like the Little Village Environmental Justice Organization, folks that have been fighting against metal shredders and pet coke and other things on the southeast side, etc., starting to converge with folks that are fighting for an eco-socialist horizon of like publicly owned poles and wires, and seeing the convergence between the two.
Awesome. Thank you, Sean. I think it's really important that, like, for this panel, the reason why I wanted it to be here is because it's really important to have those boots on the ground. A lot of this is going to be educating the general public on how these systems work, making those connections so it's not something obscure that you talk to your alderman about, So in that regard, Alicia, you are not in an on the ground public power campaign, and instead, like, you're focused on transferring those assets at the state level. Can I ask what caused you to take that approach rather than the single community municipalization effort approach?
So I think I should clarify things a little bit, because we are pursuing a number of different strategies, and I've been with Public Power New Mexico for about a year. And before I joined, I know we did get some local resolutions and around studying municipalization passed in certain communities. It recently, I think we're going to reassess its role in our strategy. We recently had a very close collaborator, advisor, someone who had been on the ground working on community choice aggregation enabling legislation, basically say that he thinks that that's not the right approach anymore because it gives the utilities too much power when they still have the power over the transmission and the distribution. They make it hard for these community-owned entities to, you know, actually be successful. And there's a lot of challenges in California, for example, where they've written the rule book and it puts these community-owned aggregators at a disadvantage. And just for anyone who may not know what CCAs are, that's basically just gives municipalities or counties or regional aggregates or tribal governments the authority to generate, purchase power, price and sell electricity, and invest it in their own communities, but the utility still would own the grid. So it's not like full on municipalization. So that's kind of raised a lot of questions for us in terms of our strategy. But, you know, in our last effort to create CCA enabling legislation in New Mexico, we got different resolutions from local governments around the state, which we have done previously. And so we've been in an ongoing process of building those relationships with local governments. You know, we're also looking at how we can help them access federal funding for brick and mortar projects in the meantime. So those are just some of the strategies we've employed. You know, in the past, we have tried to get the state to study statewide public power. I think for many in our coalition, that is the ultimate end goal of our work is statewide public power, or at least, you know, small decentralized, you know, municipal utilities that are maybe connected to a statewide run grid, publicly owned grid. But I think strategically we're a bit away from that. Like we still want to study it, we still want to push for that, but the public will isn't there. And again, that comes down to distrust of the government and its competence. You know, and another thing that we are going to look at and see what emerges is, you know, as community solar gets off the ground here, we're really interested to see there's about, so we have 22 federally recognized tribal governments in the ground in Santa Fe and New Mexico. And about 8 of them are eligible to do really large community solar projects that don't have the limitations that a lot of the other projects have. Like our law was very limited, again, because of the utilities, the compromise, the investor-owned utilities. But, you know, that law for most folks caps it at 5 megawatts a project, 200 megawatts for the whole state. But there's 8 tribes within the IOU territory that can have unlimited, their projects can be as big as they want them to. They aren't restricted in terms of who they can sell to, and they can sell beyond their tribal boundaries to some of the larger metropolitan areas of the state. And we're really interested to see how that's going to look and what might happen there, because we think that that potentially could be a way to push forward public power. So I've been rambling on a lot, but we're just interested in pursuing all the strategies because of the challenging landscape we're in and how we can be creative to advance these kinds of community-owned solutions as quickly as possible.
Thank you. And just to engage with that, I'm hearing you guys are looking at it as a holistic approach and you're timing your responses for communities you interact with. Awesome. So thank you all so much for like participating and engaging with the panel. I'm going to open up the last 15 minutes for questions. Sorry, I'm trying to read this one in the chat. Oh, that's not a question. Do we have questions in the chat? Or you can we pull people off mute, Liz?
I believe there's a question inside that comment, which is, oh, no. I thought you said, can you still? You can, never mind. Agreed. It's not, not a question at all.
If we don't have any more general questions, I
I
do
have a
have.
question. I
Oh, awesome.
wasn't sure if we could come off mute.
Absolutely, Deirdre.
Okay, so sorry if this question has been addressed, but just wondering, was there any sort of collaboration with other, multiple states with the work that you're doing, or even looking at examples with, maybe in another country, or just wondering if you guys had any examples of those? And it helped you in making the decisions on what you were doing with your work.
I know Greg is particularly suited to this question. Sean and Alicia, please jump in. I was just there for some of the A2P2 planning process.
Yeah, we were inspired by a lot of different efforts. We actually met with several members from Chicago DSA early into our campaign and got a lot of great advice, especially around the feasibility study part of the process. And I'm hoping that we learn some lessons that'll help us in our coming feasibility study here in the next few weeks. Decorah, Iowa, we also met with them and we learned a lot, just kind of both from just their messaging on how they kind of went about taking this on this and also just like kind of the logistics of like the type of stuff they did. They were the ones that really advised us to get some legal work done on municipalization, and that proved invaluable. And then of course our Power Maine, which I think a lot of us are looking at very admirably, and their work taking the entire state under public power, which if you do not know, that's going to be on their ballot in November. And I'm sure that they'd appreciate every single dollar or word of support that you can give to them. I know that there was discussion yesterday about the convening up in Maine. I'm very excited to be going up to that. And I will also just take this moment to slightly shamelessly plug our event on the 17th, where Seth Berry, one of the leaders of the Our Power Maine movement, will be actually here in Ann Arbor to do a roundtable with several of the other leaders in our movement about public power, and that will be a hybrid meeting. So anyone, even if you're not in the Ann Arbor area, if you'd like to attend that, there's a link to it on our website in AnnArborPublicPower.org. I think it's going to be a really fantastic event, and I'm really excited for it.
Awesome. Go ahead.
I was just gonna say that, like, yeah, for me, I became aware of the strategy of municipalization through like organizing with Jackson and some folks that pursued the municipalization campaign in Minneapolis with community energy partnerships back in the mid 2000s, and like learning about the energy system from some of those folks, and then working with other DSA chapters. Democratic Socialists of America chapters to build out the eco-socialist Green New Deal principles, trade tactics, like think about how we're building organization together. Another group that I would say, because you mentioned other countries, another group that I have had a couple of conversations with and really value their resources is called Trade Unions for Energy Democracy, TUED. They are a grouping of folks. I'll drop the link in a sec here. They're a grouping of folks that are, they're like trade unionists. So the folks in New York that just passed the Build Public Renewables Act, they were just meeting with the Korean Confederation of Trade Unionists, which is like a militant left-wing group of unionists that were, like talking together about, okay, what is the model of what you're doing for taking state power, building across labor and community organizing? What tactics are you using, and would this be feasible for us? So yeah, I think that that's a really good question, and like becoming aware of those histories of campaigns just kind of helps spark people's imaginations for a different future, and it's one of the most important things that we can do. So
Alicia, I'm sorry. Do you want to engage with what folks outside of New Mexico or other communities you've been able to like draw inspiration from and share information with?
Yeah, absolutely. And we're an active part of a number of different groups that are working towards energy democracy and different kinds of policies. So I think it's invaluable to learn, what other people are doing and what they're learning from, in terms of their successes, their challenges, their adaptations. One thing that didn't come up in this conversation in this session yet, but your mention of the radical trade unionists made me think of it, is really the need for building intersectional movements. And I think there is a common thread that I've observed from my conversations nationally, is that a lot of times the more conservative trade unions members frequently act in the interests of the investor-owned utilities. At least that was our experience on the ground here. And I've heard other stories in terms of people trying to municipalize or do CCA work, like they've had some trouble getting union support. And so I think that is a key strategy. That we're really interested in learning from how other people are building these connections and getting a broad base of support from lots of different sectors for many different reasons. And I think that that's an essential part of our success. But yeah, I think these kinds of national conversations are invaluable because it's a local movement, but it's also a global movement. There's so much we have in common, even though we're in very different places doing a little bit different work. There's lots of common threads and lots of ways we can connect and learn from one another.
I am so glad you said that. That's absolutely been my key takeaway from the entire project. Although we're really siloed in the particular issues of our communities, a lot of these issues are shared, a lot of the policy issues are shared, and a lot of the things we have to overcome, we're going to have to do together. I do want to engage just for a second with the distrust of government and how you all are, as campaigners, are like dealing with that in the general populace, as well as like engaging with like how to make sure your community is going to be confident with their power generation.
I can speak to that a bit. I certainly think that, especially, just all of us being Americans, we've been subject to Reaganomics for so long that it just kind of feels built into our DNA almost, that there's like this distrust of government out there. But I think that, for one, there's also a distrust of large monopolies, right? And if you can kind of make that argument to people like, well, what do you want to have this type of power over you? Do you want this large monopoly that functions like a government, except for you can't have a say in it? Or do you want some more local board that you actually get some say over and you can actually have some control over? And I mean, it also helps that public power just outperforms investor-owned utilities so well, right? It's not like we're making this argument on ideological grounds alone, right? Like, we're able to point at other examples and say, hey, I get it, our roads suck, right? But so do the roads in Lansing also suck, and yet their power costs way less, and they hardly ever lose any power, right? And so I think that, it's worth acknowledging those arguments, because every local government has its issues, right? I mean, I think we've heard a ton of different issues with different local governments or even state governments and beyond, right, throughout this meeting. However, I think you can also just make an argument on, well, the incentive structures of a public power utility and the way that they operate just lead to better outcomes. And even if there are issues with, local electeds and local governments, at least there is a mechanism by which we can address it, where there just isn't with investor-owned utilities. So, it's a tough argument, but I think that you kind of, if someone is making that argument to you, it's almost a gift, because then you get to explain all the benefits of municipalization along with it.
Yeah, the thing that I would say is that, in terms of distrust of government and that sort of thing, is like, yeah, I'm part of a openly socialist organization that believes in the project of taking state power, and there's a lot of nonprofits, 501c3 organizations that can't engage with that sort of thing, that are not allowed to engage in partisan politics, and that's like one of the tensions that's there. But for me, coming from a much more partisan place, I think there's a balance of a key part of our strategy was, we're going to endorse candidates who are going to be accountable to our organization, to a mass base that is going to be carrying forward our demands. It's part of why organized labor still has so much power too. They also are a mass base. They're not like an NGO that is being controlled by foundations making undemocratic decisions or whatever. We're a mass base in the community, and in theory, a candidate who's elected by that base should be accountable to that base. But it's also a vision that we haven't seen, because going back to Reagan and even before that too, we just see all like our social base, our social institutions being completely stripped, not only from the right wing, but also from the Democrats too. And so that's part of why like we are running candidates and having electeds that are accountable to our community, that are engaging in democratic decision making. And also, I think part of rebuilding that trust in government, building that trust in the public, and rebuilding our social institutions is rebuilding that everyday practice of democracy too. So that's part of why, I try and be really intentional when we're talking about what is our strategy, what are our tactics, like how are we actually getting people to engage in that process of democratic decision making in their everyday lives, in the volunteer organizations that they're a part of, because then it infuses the politic of demanding that from government while still participating in that too. And yeah, it's hard when there's like millions of people that are dead from COVID, and we see mass abandonment for everything, and we see the planet on fire and things getting worse. But like, what else is there to do but fight and inspire that like horizon, and make sure that we're leaving a better world for ourselves and also for future generations too.
Alicia, if you'd like to engage with that question, please do.
Yeah, I'll just piggyback on that. And I found that very inspiring. I would say that some of the ways that we're approaching restoring trust in government and is really highlighting positive examples. And, when we initially started to do some research on the utility landscape in New Mexico, we found that on average, the 7 municipal utilities in our state had 25% lower average residential monthly bills based on EIA data. And, we're in contact with them and working to learn more about their the benefits and their stories, and highlighting stories about solar and things like that local governments own, and the cost savings and the investments and what that money's been redirected to. So that's a huge part of it too. We're also going to undertake some polling to understand people's sentiments around solar and public power policies and their trust in government, to understand kind of what is there. And we're going to do some localized research too. I think one of the things that I found, at least in New Mexico, is, examples from other places don't resonate with people here. We really need localized examples, localized research. So those are the kinds of things we're working on. And then also, the sorts of public building and infrastructure solar projects that I mentioned, highlighting those, supporting those, fundraising for those, getting funding for those. Those are things that I think can also help make the case for municipalization and other forms of public power.
Absolutely. We are just at time. I appreciate you all so much. This is the aspect I came into the fight on the organizing side, on the, hey, let's get our local muni. So it's particularly dear to me, and it's a fight about returning the power to make these choices to people in our communities rather than large corporations. So thank you for sharing. Thank you all for asking your questions. We're going to have a 15-minute bio break.